Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, your friend, James Delingpole, and my very special guest this week is called Simon Lincoln Reeder. Simon and I go back about 10 years, is it, Simon?
10 years, indeed.
Simon was actually, I've made lots of friends this way. Simon was a fan who contacted me on Facebook, and I always remember him because he came up with one of the best invitations I've ever had. He said, come out to South Africa, where Simon's South African, and you can kill as many game birds as you like. We have this amazing weekend where we go to the lake and we just go and kill shit. And I thought, I so want to take this guy up on his invitation. It sounds like the most fun thing. I haven't done it yet. It's gonna happen, I think, provided that my shoulder hasn't been ruined by the implant in my after my fox hunting accident. I've got a wretched pin in my shoulder.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I worry about the recoil, Simon. That I may have to have surgery before I come, if and when it happens. Anyway, so I bumped into Simon at a party the other day, at the Spectator party, and we bonded, as people of a right-wing persuasion do, in a world dominated by liberals and general ghastliness. And yeah, here he is on the Delingpole podcast, and the reason I'm keen to talk to him particularly is that Simon's gotten in on South African politics from the perspective of somebody who's thinking, oh my God, you think you are stuffed in the UK or in America, but just you wait till you hear what's going on in South Africa. So Simon, how does it feel as a South African watching what's happened under your country under Jacob Zuma?
I have, I've always been very clear, James, on my outlook on how things should happen. And I was obviously disappointed because when the ANC took over in 1994, it was never going to happen in the way that I should have, and I'm speaking from an economic perspective.
So the ANC took over in 1994.
Yes.
Where does Mandela fit into this timeline?
So Mandela was the liberation president, and as you know, he died in 2013. But he was this triumphant liberation movement leader, and the ANC obviously. Took over government in 1994, and they've gone through a range of economic beliefs, and what you see today is a consequence of what Mandela initially espoused to some sort of a bizarre, sadistic economic experience that no one really understands.
So it started bad and got worse.
Well, it was always going to start bad. It was always going to start bad because Mandela was a communist.
Yeah.
And this is what he was, and this was something that it's not a bad. We're not trying to expose anyone. The fact is that it emerged post his death that he was a communist, a member of the South African Communist Party, and it's something that he hid because he was scared of the consequences in the world. But if I could just take you back a little bit more for this to make a bit more sense. Mandela in 1993, I think it was taken to Davos for the first time. All right.
That sounds scary already. I'm not liking this. Yeah.
Well, I think that Davos then had a bit more credibility than it does now. Although I've never been a fan, but I think that the participants then were a bit more humble in the way that they presented themselves merely as market operatives as opposed to market controllers. But anyway, what happened was that during this expedition to China, to Davos, Mandela was introduced to the Chinese delegation, and of course, having been imprisoned for 27 years, wasn't really aware of the changes that had happened there, and fawned over them in a manner of, well, I can't believe that I'm meeting these true communists and so on. And the Chinese all looked at each other awkwardly and took him aside and said, well, thank you for your words, but I'm afraid this doesn't really happen here. And it had a profound effect upon Mandela, that encounter, because he came back to South Africa realizing that actually they were talking about communism as a government, the Chinese were, but they weren't really practicing it. It was more for appearances. And what he did was essentially try and do that with the South African government. He appointed a Minister of Finance who was relatively austere, responsible, and guarded the independence of the Treasury. And that has been eroded completely. Where it stands today from where it was has been eroded. And that is why the impression of South Africa, everything comes down to economics.
So what you're saying is that actually when Mandela first came to power, it was kind of a golden era, relatively, for South Africa.
Yeah, I think that he opened the markets. As I said, he appointed someone who was responsible. Trevor Manuel never had much practical experience. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, he was a physical education teacher, but he was regarded as being a safe hand, and everyone subsequent. But since the problem was that this upset 2/4 of people in South Africa, what Mandela essentially did. And those were the die-hard communists, those people who cheered when the USSR invaded the likes of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And the second group of people that he annoyed by this path were people who had this very tribal and very provincial understanding of the country and their place in it. And they believed that now the ANC had assumed power, had assumed political power. What was to follow that was economic power. But the world had changed from this perspective, and it was a combination of their anger. It's been a combination of their anger the standard useless socialist policies that have propelled the country to where it is seen.
Presumably, there's a kind of, you get this a lot in Africa, don't you? That the dominant tribe in any country feels that it ought to have a significant take of the spoils. That's just how things work, isn't it? And presumably that was the case when Mandela got to power. They all thought, well, don't care about Whitey. It's our turn now. Forget about the people who may have own the factories and be senior in finances. Now we want black people, South Africans, in key positions everywhere.
Yes, I think, and for a long time there was, whilst Mandela, don't forget that Mandela and his successor Mbeki were Xhosas, and and Jacob Zuma is Zulu. So there's always tribal jostling that we don't participate as white South Africans. We understand, but obviously But
Zulu is relatively a minority next to the Xhosas.
I can't give you an accurate illustration of the numbers, but those are the two dominant political. And for a long time, the Xhosas, which are spelt KXOSA, were called the Xhosa Nostra.
See, I can't do that. That clicking is very impressive. Well done.
So they were given Mandela and Mbeki, and then Jacob Zuma, to an extent, absolutely rode in on a tribal Zulu ticket, and that was in 2000, at the end of 2007 in Polokwane, where he was elected president of the ANC.
And so you had Mandela, who was okay-ish, Mbeki, who was worse,
yes,
and now you've got Zuma, who is way the worst of the bunch. Yeah, is that more or less the?
That is. But James, I don't buy into the idea that Jacob Zuma is evil. I think that word is used a lot, and I run the risk of enraging my countrymen. But I think that there are a lot more evil people than Jacob Zuma. There's Grace Mugabe, there's Robert Mugabe's spokesperson, George Chiramba, there's other spin doctors running around South Africa who I think are far more evil. I think Jacob Zuma is fundamentally a product of his environment, and this is the good thing about us conservatives, is that we're far more empathetic than we are perceived. I see Jacob Zuma's behavior through the dimension of time and consequence. And if you look at, I think that he is corrupt, absolutely, but you've also got to remember that when you're talking about this man in the context of good and evil, this was a guy who was imprisoned on Robben Island for 10 years and who did not receive a single family visitor for 10 years because they were too poor to come and see him. He wasn't on the inside on Robben Island. There was a ANC royalty that he was not considered a part of. And what is happening now is that we're evaluating him on expectations that we had of people like Mandela and Mbeki, which are irresponsible.
Right. Okay. But nevertheless, South Africa has gone down. I mean, what's the rand done in the last 10 years? Or
this morning it stands at 1684 to the pound, which is probably, at the end of 2015, when Jacob Zuma pulled one of his special moves, it was closing on 24 rand to the pound. So we have climbed back a bit, but the currency has absolutely taken a beating as a result of his presidency.
We can talk about more of this in a moment. Presumably it makes it a very good deal for travellers, for
Absolutely.
Americans and British, whatever.
Yes, without question.
I mean, can you live like a chieftain?
You can. You see, well, there are lots of expats running around Cape Town. The city profits from anything, but there's so much property that is owned by expats, and so much of the standard of living has improved thanks to expats that Cape Town is probably one of the most idyllic and magical existences in the world. It's cheap, the labor is cheap, it's safer than other parts of the country, and it's breathtakingly beautiful.
Yeah, what's not to like apart from the great whites?
Apart from the great whites,
which I've been diving with these great whites in.
I read so. I read that in Finn.
Oh yes, that's right. That's I did. God, you are a loyal fan. Like, you've actually read my second novel about my fear of being eaten by a shark. That's very good. Yeah, I went to Hunts Bay and went down in the cage with the great whites, and they came up to my cage and
did you stroke one?
Did their shot. Do you know what? My finger was probably about an inch away from it. There was a scary man who was running the trip who said, "You cannot touch the sharks, man." and so I didn't actually touch the sharks, but I wish I had, because I now can't say to you I've touched a great white shark. I've just been within spitting distance of it. Anyway, maybe we'll talk about South African tourism in a moment, but I'm just interested in the economy. Now, I understand that one of the problems with the Zuma regime is that he's been sort of ensnared by a bunch of Indians. Is that the sort of deal?
That's about the size of it. There was an Indian immigrant family called the Guptas that are no relation to the great Indian dynasty, that arrived in the late 90s from India and who set up a shoe shop not far from where I used to live. In fact, I was their neighbor for a long time. I know the Gupta family, not personally, but by the fact that I used to live very close to them. And so these guys arrived in the late 1990s, and they started, after this shoe exercise the shoe shop had collapsed, they went into computers, then they went into mining, then they went into aviation, then they went into magazines and media, and they have designed absolutely an organized criminal empire that is unraveling as we speak. And where they were so clever was that in 2005, when Jacob Zuma was subjected to rape charges, he was acquitted of raping a family friend's daughter, who incidentally died last year. But this young lady had gone around to his house, and that was also not far from where I lived, and that is where the alleged attack took place. But he was acquitted, and it was the Guptas at that time he was suspended from the ANC, Jacob Zuma was, the Guptas ensnared him, as you say, and literally supported him throughout the rape trial and thereafter to his ascent back into.
So you mean they bankrolled him?
They bankrolled him, and yes, and they employed his son, who is rumored to be his favorite son, and they employed his daughter, and they employed his wife, and they really did surround him. And because, as I mentioned earlier, Jacob Zuma has this peculiar relationship with money, and for obvious reason, it was something that he was never going to decline. He allowed himself to be in this position where this family could bankroll him.
It sounds quite Game of Thrones, this scenario. I'm not sure who the Game of Thrones characters analogous to the Guptas would be, but how did they?
A poor man's Rasputin. That's what it probably, something like that. Sorry.
No. How did they? They must be quite good businessmen in order to have accumulated that money in the first place to be able to bribe people and stuff, which is what they do.
No, I don't think that they're good businessmen. I think they're extremely manipulative, and I think that they took advantage of the circumstances of everyone that they've ever encountered, and that's where their success has been. They claim to be successful businessmen. I think that they might be okay with accounting and so on, but they've never built or established anything that is remarkable. They had a resources company that's been delisted 3 days ago because it has no sponsors anymore. They are poisonous. People do not want anything to do with them. And as this is unraveled, it goes to the point you've just made, that nobody wants anything to do with them.
So is all this in the public domain? I mean, I'm not going to get sued by the Gupta's lawyers for defaming them.
No, it's all in the public domain, courtesy of a vast email leak and some very good reporting journalism, investigative journalism by South Africans.
Right, because I think most people listening to this podcast won't have heard of the Guptas. They probably don't even know that the South African president is Jacob Zuma.
And they probably forgot that there's a country called South Africa.
Yeah.
It's been so unexceptional for the last few years, so I'm not surprised.
But how did I mean, there must be a business community in South Africa. There must be some kind of legacy judicial system that tries to keep order. How did this family become so powerful, and why could nobody stop them?
Well, I think that one of the things that Jacob Zuma has been really successful in doing has been planting people that are of his profile into either cabinet positions, on the boards of state-owned enterprises and the utilities, and in key administrative positions, be they police or the prosecuting authority. And the profile, 90% of the time, of the appointee is that of someone weak, inexperienced, and quite possibly starstruck at having been appointed by Zuma, there to protect him.
Right. So has every public position been given to a friend of the?
Just about.
Well, what does that make it like living in the new South Africa?
Well, the reality is that it's and here's where there is corporate South Africa has got a lot of money. It's sitting on vast stockpiles waiting to invest, and the reason why it doesn't is that it cannot trust the political leadership. And there is this impasse. The ANC does not trust business, and it has never historically trusted business, and now business almost certainly does not trust the ANC for good reason. So, but saying that, there is work that is there, and people are happy, and there is no sense of Zimbabwe about it.
So we're not going to have another Zimbabwe, because I mean that presumably is the fear of everyone who owns property in South Africa. Everyone who's got a stake in the economy must be thinking, we're next. We're going to get all the remaining whites expropriated, and the country's going to go down the pan. There's going to be a bloodbath or something.
I think that is why this campaign by the Guptas on which Bell Pottinger executed, which is the public relations firm here, has been so destructive is because that was their key message. What Bell Pottinger delivered on behalf of the Guptas to protect their name had the essence of a racial war about it, which is what happened in Zimbabwe.
So I see. So the Bell Pottinger campaign said, be nice to the Guptas, or it could go seriously tits up.
Well, what they said was that the whites still have the money, and it's a highly, and this is something that is deeply complicated, and they simplified it, which is a tragedy. They simplified a hugely complicated, very, very old problem of wealth inequality into an issue of good versus evil, white versus black, and that had the makings of a race war, meaning that if you keep black people away from resources, if white it had the appearance that white people were intentionally.
I see.
Yes,
Okay.
So
that's I can see why, as a white South African particularly, you might find that a bit kind of irresponsible.
Look, James, the Bell Pottinger have no future. As far as I'm concerned, I would be amazed if they do, because the response from the South Africans and civil society at large, as well as the non-governmental organizations, has been to force them into a corner. This is a company that has represented the likes of other dictators in the world and very controversial organizations, that they are being undone by South African civil society as a result of their work for this Indian immigrant family is a extraordinary thing. I find it remarkable.
Interesting. Well, this is the kind of stuff that I can't imagine you're going to hear on any other podcast, because no other podcast casts its net quite so widely. You're listening to me, James Delingpole, presenting the Delingpole podcast, with my very special guest, Simon Lincoln Reader. More about South Africa and finance and all sorts of other interesting stuff, maybe sharks even, again, in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Tim Schmidt is joining us now. He's a president and founder of U.S. Concealed Carry Association.
The best part about concealed carry is that everybody doesn't have to do it for the vast majority of the population to get the benefit. You're going to have this powerful deterrent effect. Naturally, crime will go down because they're never going to know who's going to have the gun.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Mr. Simon Lincoln Reader. Simon, I should have explained, is not only a journalist who writes about South African affairs, but he's also in the tech industry, he's the CEO of an incredibly successful and up and coming and soon to be world dominating tech company that specializes in foreign exchange called Fourex. That's not as in the Australian lager. Fourex, Fourex. I'm not saying that to plug the company. It's more that I'm interested in meeting a South African who's making a real go of things in the modern world. And I was saying to you earlier on, Simon, like, how come you're rich and successful and I'm just a kind of struggling hack? How did you get to be successful? And you said to me that there's something in the South African gene whereby you're brought up in a climate which is so sort of deleterious to doing good business because of various factors that it makes you hungry and quite used to kind of adversity. Is that about it?
Yes, I think you'd want to be rich and successful more than but
what you mean? You look at the mother country, as it were. You look at Britain, and you think, yeah, you bastards. I want some of that, and I could do it much better than you.
Yeah, I think that serves it has certainly served me as a huge motivator, and I believe that these guys come to London from South Africa, and succeed because they believe in hard work, and because there's no bullshit about many of them, they don't have they've never been exposed to a culture of benefits, and not say that there's anything bad.
No.
Okay,
Oh,
but
there
there's
is, actually.
Okay, yeah.
Of course there
I
is.
just don't want to. And there's
No, I think look,
the diminished sense of entitlement is a huge, and certainly amongst the people I work with. And bear in mind, my company is South African. We have a South African. Our founders were South African. Our venture capital partners are South African. I'm South African, and we have a number of staff that are employed on our factory floor. And it is a spirit that we inadvertently, unconsciously carry, which is you do what you can as best as you can, as often as you can, as hard as you can, and that is all that you can, I suppose, do in an environment that isn't, that's not your home.
So tell me, take the average American or the average British person and the average South African, white South African. Would you say that South Africans are less prone to PC bullshit then, or are they subject to that as well?
I think they're becoming more so. They're a little bit, there's a creep of liberalism. There was a creep of liberalism amongst my generation, where people were paying more and more attention to political correctness. But generally speaking, and specifically amongst the South Africans here, especially amongst the South Africans here, I think you'd find a much less emphasis, or even they're not really bothered. They just go and call a spade, work as hard as they can, and then go home.
Before I forget, your university system is completely stuffed, isn't it? I mean, the whole Black Lives Rhodes Must Fall, which infected Oxford University. The campaign to remove a statue of Cecil Rhodes from Oriel College. Cecil Rhodes, the great magnate explorer, etc., empire builder, donated some money to his old college, Oriel College, which created the Rhodes Scholarships for the university.
Yes.
And there was a statue in his honour, and he funded, I think, he left a legacy which enabled people to go and study at Oriel and so on. And one of the, or maybe two or three black South Africans on Rhodes Scholarships came to Oxford and led the campaign to remove his statue, Rhodes Must Fall. And I understand this originated in Cape Town. Tell me about that.
So it all started with a bucket of shit being thrown at the statue, and that was in 2015 in January.
Quite recently.
Yeah. And this someone I didn't know him personally, but he was a black student that had spent many years at UCT, threw this bucket of poo at the statue, and
he was called the Poo Flinger.
That's right.
What was his name?
He's so irrelevant that I've completely forgotten.
Yeah.
I do know it, but he's a very troubled child and causing, attention seeking and so on. But he spawned the idea of this symbolism, this resistance against Rhodes, and these people look at Rhodes I don't understand. Especially, I never understood what was happening in Oxford. I know that these guys made a terrible image for the country. The one chap was later caught being incredibly rude to a waitress in a restaurant in Observatory in Cape Town.
A white waitress.
Yes, and you can judge a man how you judge people on how they treat staff in a restaurant, which tells you everything you need to know. But to answer your question, the symbolism that this of throwing a bucket of poo at a statue and the statue ultimately being removed. Cecil John Rhodes donated vast amount of money to our botanical gardens. He created these Rhodes Scholarships, and he is seen as this murdering, slaughtering white imperialist. He was also a heavily repressed homosexual. And if the students are as open-minded as they want to be, they'd see that his consequences of behavior are actually, there's a larger scope for that. Yeah.
If maybe he could be, if we could find some transgender impulse in Rhodes, maybe that would make him more sympathetic to the modern SJWs.
Yes, I think so.
But obviously by modern standards, I mean, he probably wouldn't get tenure now at Harvard or Yale. He'd probably be considered slightly beyond the pale. But he was a man of his time, wasn't he? He was an imperialist. He was an explorer, a land grabber.
Yes, God is an Englishman.
But the land was there for the grabbing. I mean, it wasn't like these people had their own massive civilization that was going to stay there forever, was it?
Of course. And this was the idea of empire, and I learned that from my grandfather. And whatever thoughts one has about it, it was as its time, as in, anti-fascist marches in California are of their time now. So.
Well, I think I think the thing that's missing from this debate is historical context. And I've travelled quite widely in Africa, and I've seen the effects of colonialism on different countries. And one conclusion you fairly quickly reach if you study the behaviour of, say, the British in Africa and, say, the Germans in southwest Africa, where they wiped out the Herero, was it?
Yes, and what about the Congolese and
the
Belgians?
The Belgians in the Congo, who raped the Congo,
Yeah.
absolutely destroyed it. And the French were sort of slightly better, but not much.
Yeah.
So the British, everyone was doing it. The Portuguese,
Yep.
the Spanish.
Italians.
This was the behaviour of the time, so it's all relative, isn't it? But I covered the Rhodes Must Fall thing for Breitbart, and I looked into the backgrounds of these characters, these beneficiaries of the Rhodes scholarships, and my initial reaction was that this is a gesture of incredible ingratitude, regardless of your personal politics. It seems to me to be very ungenerous to your host institution to try and move bits of statuary and to diss somebody who's donated to the institution and probably enabled poorer students like yourself and others to enjoy the best education in the world. You're kind of pissing inside your own tent, aren't you? It's
James, absolutely. Look, I come to London and I know that there is a way to behave when you are in a different country that is not of your own, and you respect your environment and the people who occupy it. It was incredibly embarrassing to see this. Now, I don't care if Cecil John Rhodes was alive last week and whipped one of those children, and that's the response that we had. It was an unacceptable demonstration of impunity and, as you said, ungratefulness. It was shocking to have witnessed.
But what happened? I thought what happened at Oxford was bad, but when I read about what was happening at UCT, that's what it's called, University of Cape Town.
Yes,
that's far worse. Where you've got probably a small minority of very aggressive, politicised black students terrorising the university staff, vandalising paintings, disrupting exams. That because we've seen some awful things happening on American campuses. We've seen what Black Lives Matter's done at Mizzou and other universities. But it seems to me that South Africa is by far the worst. I'm surprised you even have an academic, a graduate.
And the leadership of the institutions, particularly the UCT, was so poor at the time and still is today. And you have this kowtowing and this really dismissive attitude toward the realities of that. And the realities, as far as I'm concerned, were really bad behavior, a disruption for the other students, and this tolerance and this belief, the idea that Cecil John Rhodes still represents something that you can burn paintings and books about which is what happened, and in the damage to public property. And it's very, very hard to see where this is going. But then again, these racial campaigns, such as Black Lives Matter, they're very difficult to identify. It's so hard to aim because their objective is so wild. They're so hard to aim. You don't know what they mean. I don't know if you know that the University of Sydney gave Black Lives Matter a prize.
Did they?
The Sydney University Peace Prize. They gave it to them last month.
Yeah, certainly.
It's ridiculous.
When you bring up Australia, I've met some PC characters in my time. I think that PC is more deeply entrenched under liberals in Australia than it is anywhere else. I don't know why it is that I think partly it's this hang up they have about the, what are they called, the First Peoples or something. They've got this massive hang up about that. But Australia, which used to be the land of these ockers with their corks dangling from their hats and Crocodile Dundee and all that, they've now become these, well, I mean, just so PC, it's
Precisely.
Just unbearable.
I'm not mad about it, to be honest with you. I think this is all a big deception. You've got people like Malcolm Turnbull and Julia Gillard and all these people who looked like very sophisticated. Not Julia Gillard, sorry. You had Tony Abbott. No, she's most certainly a gimp. But Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull have come across as being these urbane, worldly...
more Turnbull than... I mean, Abbott, to be fair to him, got completely done over by the climate mafia, whereas Turnbull is part of the climate mafia.
Of course he is.
I think poor old Tony Abbott was I think a fairly regular guy, God-fearing Catholic bloke, worked for his local fire brigade, did volunteers, went and spent time working with Aborigines, etc., etc. So I think he was.
Wasn't he a Rhodes Scholar?
What, Turnbull or
Abbott?
I think he might have been, yeah.
Yeah, I think he was.
Yeah. Well, there have been some good people who've been Rhodes Scholars. I mean, the one that comes to mind is Chris Christopher.
Yes, he's my favourite. He's my worst, Bill Clinton.
He's the least likely, and there were a few. There were a few when I was there. Who was the pollster? Frank Luntz. I think he was a contemporary, a Rhodes Scholar, contemporary of mine. But I worry about what's going on in academia across the world, because of course a premium is still misguidedly perhaps placed on people who've had further education. I mean, if you want to get a job, if you want to work for Goldman Sachs, if you want to get the kind of high-powered job that you've got in finance or business, you've pretty much got to have a university degree, at least.
I don't have a university degree.
No. Do you not?
The best education that I had, and it was something that prepared me for Johannesburg, for living for 13 years in Johannesburg, which prepared me for coming to London, was that I worked in a game reserve at a safari ranch. And no university degree could have ever prepared me for the environment that I went into. So I disagree with that.
Oh. No, I don't think it's anything to agree or disagree. I think it's an objective fact at the moment that actually recruitment
firms, absolutely. No, I do accept that. Yes.
Yeah. But actually, you've opened up an avenue of thought there to me, because when I was at university in the 1980s, it turns out that every single one of my contemporaries from Oxford has turned out to be a liberal pinko sellout scumtard. I mean, it's just a fact. You know, I almost include even Boris Johnson in that, and I certainly include David Cameron.
Of course.
And I even I'm even starting to include Michael Gove in that. It's just amazing what a bunch of sellouts my generation were. But at least there was a semblance of an impression at the time that you weren't being brainwashed by your dons, and that all your contemporaries weren't communists, which is basically what they all are now.
Yes.
They're all Corbynists.
They're all communists.
Which is the same thing.
Oh.
I mean, my tutors were not obviously political, and when I did English, politics never crept into the way I was taught, so that was great. So I was probably the last generation. Anyway, I'm more interested having ranted a little, to go back to your game reserve. And one thing I wanted to ask you, I once went on a trip in Namibia to the Skeleton Coast, and on the trip there was a guy who had worked on a game reserve, and he told me that he had never had so much sex in all his life as when he was working on a game reserve. And he said that girls get, there is this thing that happens called khaki fever, and that all these girls on their trips, often with their parents, just end up in bed with the game guides. Is that true?
Where I worked and was very lucky to work at, that was strictly forbidden. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but one had to be a hell of a lot more discreet about it. I was caught walking a single lady back to her room, and nothing happened, but I was reported for crossing the deck, because the villas are all situated on a riverbank, and you have to walk down a long plank, and you walk them to their rooms, obviously.
Yeah, in case of lion attack.
In case of lion,
attack.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so many things. And I was caught walking at night, and that was reported back. I was young.
Do you know who reported you?
No, I always wanted to torture. There was a guy there called Millington Matabula, and he belonged to a local union, and I always thought it was him. I had fantasies about torturing him with a black mamba, but I never got around to doing that.
Millington Matabula. Right, I see. Well, probably just as well that you never found out whether it was him or not, because black mamba torture, I mean, that would be... Did you see any mambas?
Yeah. You know that this is how they torture rhino poachers to get all the information out. What they do is that, they would kind of catch a guy who is clearly with the intention of killing a rhino as a part of some syndicate, which inevitably comes from China, originates in China or Vietnam. And what happens is that they catch the guy, and he's a local, and they say to him, no, please give us the information about your friend Hong or whatever. And he says, no, I'm not going to talk. So they take him into a room, and you tie him to a chair, and then you just release a black mamba into the room from the doorway, and then he just sings. He tells everything. So it isn't, I mean, I don't condone torture, but it's a very effective way of fighting this war against rhino poaching.
How did they stop the mamba actually biting the person?
No, it's never going to bite. It's unless you corner it, it wants to escape more than anything else.
Because certainly I've seen from my Steve Irwin documentaries that if you stay very calm.
Yes.
But except I thought the mamba was a particularly aggressive...
Look, I think if you upset it, and if you, they can travel up to, they can travel on 2/3 of their body, so they can be this high, they're going in 28 miles an hour. Sorry, 18 to 25 miles an hour.
You couldn't outrun a mamba, could you?
So if it's traveling like that and it hits an object like a vehicle in the road, it gets very angry, obviously, because it's smacked into.
Oh, I see.
And it's natural instinct, and I'm not the world's authority on the subject, but its natural instinct is to be quiet and to make babies and not to interfere with humans, and hopefully for humans not to interfere with it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think isn't that sweet that we're having a friendly word on behalf of the black mamba, the much maligned black mamba party.
I saw my uncle in Botswana once. My uncle, a great man. He, my cousin and I. My family had a property on the border, still do, of Botswana, and I was about. I think I was about 11, and my cousin, who lives in London here, he was about 8, and we were driving past this. We saw in a tree, and the thing must have been 2 meters long. And it was the first time I ever saw a black mamba, and I shouted at my uncle. My uncle got out of the vehicle with his side by side. He had a shotgun, and he stood on the bonnet of the vehicle, and he shot the thing 6 times, and it just went into pieces, like that. We watched this thing being blasted away. But obviously, he's got a son in the vehicle, and and the mamba was by the time we'd seen it, it was moving very quickly. But it was fascinating to watch this.
That's a sad story. That doesn't make me happy. No, I really like snakes.
Okay, have you had
I've been bitten 3 times by snakes, but none of them venomous. I've been bitten by an Indian python, an African python, and probably a garter snake or something.
Didn't you get stung by something like a larva? You had like you showed people.
I had
a fly or something.
No, I've been chiggers. Chiggers are these. I think there's an American jigger as well, but it's a different. A chigger is this thing that lies in the mud, and when you step on it, it comes and lays its eggs in your feet. And it's like having a kind of verruca, but filled with eggs. And when you've got a moment, you sort of you get a needle and you dig out all the white eggs, and it's quite revolting.
Wow.
Yeah, I've had every benefit. I got amoebic dysentery. I got bilharzia. I got all the horrors.
Where did you get bilharzia?
Either in the Nile, or in the River Congo, or possibly on Lake Kariba, where I went windsurfing. Although going back in time, if I wouldn't do it again, because Lake Kariba's got crocodiles.
Massive
in it.
crocodiles.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's. I mean, crocodiles are far worse than sharks, aren't they?
Much worse. They actually eat you.
Yeah.
Sharks take a bite out of you and find that they don't like the taste of human flesh, so they leave you. But where did you get bitten by your snake?
Because when I was a child, I used to keep snakes. My father used to keep snakes.
Okay.
So we had a reptile house with snakes and amphibians in it. We had crocodiles. We had all sorts. We had a 9-foot boa constrictor and a 6-foot boa constrictor called David and Bathsheba. So I've always felt comfortable with snakes, but not. I mean, venomous ones. I know they're kind of bad. You don't want to tread on a puff adder. You don't want to get got by a mamba because it's like curtains.
A guy that I worked with got bitten by a black mamba. He was studying in the field, and he drove himself to hospital 2 hours away. But he said that it took him. I've been bitten by a spider, and that took me a very long time to recover from as well. It's the same
really?
neurotoxic venom. And
what sort of spider was it called?
Black widow. It's the equivalent button, the black widow.
Yeah.
And what happened was that he drove himself. This chap I knew, he drove himself to hospital 2 hours away, when he was delirious, and he managed. But it did take him 3 years to feel okay again. That's how it took him literally 3 years, and he got bitten just on his this part of his finger.
on his knuckle, sort of, or the joint above the knuckle.
Yeah.
That's. So how did he? He must have been given anti-venin, obviously.
Yeah, look, I mean, in the area there, they had all the right but they treat you symptomatically now. You know, they put you on a life support machine for a black mamba bite, and then if your heart starts going, then they treat your heart, and your lungs start going, or your liver, or whatever.
That's interesting.
So basically, you just try to keep because that stuff is very serious. The serum that they use for.
It's as bad.
If not, it'll kill you. Yeah. So.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we may have to continue this animal death theme in the final part of the podcast. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Simon Lincoln Reeder. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Tim Schmidt is joining us now. He's a president and founder of U.S. Concealed Carry Association.
The best part about concealed carry is that everybody doesn't have to do it for the vast majority of the population to get the benefit. You're going to have this powerful deterrent effect. Naturally, crime will go down because they're never going to know who's going to have the gun.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Simon Lincoln Reeder, who's South African. He's a tech entrepreneur. He's a journalist and an ex-game ranger. Is that what they're called?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, ex-game ranger. But and since the conversation has turned to one of my favourite topics, there's not many guests I can have a talk to about deadly animals of Africa, and it is one of my favourite subjects. In fact, I can tell you, Simon, that one of my fantasies when it all kicks off, which I think is going to kick off quite soon. I mean, I think Europe is over, really. I think we're all going to go the way of Sweden. and particularly now that the Conservative Party has got so PC and SJW that they are not fit to rescue us after, when it all goes wrong. I sometimes fantasize about moving to probably the only place I think which is really viable in Africa, which is Botswana. I'd quite like to run a camp, a high-end camp in Botswana. And if I had £1 million to spare, I think you'd get one for £1 million, couldn't you?
Yes, you could, absolutely.
Wouldn't that be a good life?
It would be a wonderful life, but it's isolated and not ideal broadband speeds, I imagine. But
well, you should see where I live in the country. Actually, we're on virtually dial-up. In fact, having said that, I think I was in Botswana the year before last.
Did you meet President once?
I met
Festus Mogae.
Festus Mogae.
Yes.
Yeah, I had an audience with Festus Mogae, and he was a good man. But Botswana is the exception because the Swana are very grave people, aren't they? They're very serious-minded, business-oriented, rather dull, actually.
Yeah, they're Swiss.
It's Switzerland, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And no, they're great. I mean, my brother-in-law, his family are originally Zimbabweans, but they moved to Botswana. I've spent a bunch of time there when I was growing up at my uncle's farm. It's a great place, and I would, but at the same time, it's things don't move as quickly as you could probably have a nice piece of land in the swamps somewhere. I'm sure, absolutely. Biggest problem would be trying not to be constricted by a python.
Yeah,
which is
I think even in the capital, Gaborone, you would probably get so starved of culture and so starved of conversation after a time, because it would all be about what's happening in, I don't know, up country.
Yes.
Be sort of trivial gossip about something that happened. You would get bored. But on the other hand, I mean, I just love being in Africa, and I like to be in an Africa where you're not going to get pangered to death by, as you possibly would say if you had a farm in South Africa.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, how bad is that? How many South African farmers are getting killed?
I think that there is a watch body in the world, and I would be lying if I told you I knew which one. But there is an official watch body that has declared that the murder of farmers qualifies as genocide. The murder of farmers post 1994 qualifies as genocide, and there have been hundreds. And this year saw a spike in February. There were, I think, threefold the number of 60 in a month alone.
What? 60 farmers?
60 farmers in
killed?
Yes.
That's a hell of a lot.
Yes. I might be wrong on that fact. I'm not. Yeah, no, but there was a spike.
That is insane.
There was a spike. I stand corrected on the numbers, but there was a huge spike this year. Well, it led to this extraordinary thing where all the farmers got together, 1 million of them, on a farm in February, in the Free State, which is a central province, at about 2 months ago. The farmers, being predominantly Afrikaans, of this very sort of dour First Testament outlook, and they all got together to pray because that's how bad it was. And there were 1 million of them on a farm.
I didn't realize there were so many.
It's bad.
Farmers.
It's shocking.
Yeah.
No. It's the murder of farmers and the ANC has, to its detriment, and it will always be to its detriment, one of its greatest failures is it's never addressed this, because it has this sort of ideological view on the land being stolen. It has never protected farmers, and it's a terrible situation.
But I mean, it's very hard to up sticks and move out of your profession, and I imagine that. Well, I mean, it's so idyllic living in the African landscape and stuff that if you could make a living doing that, it would be a wonderful way to spend your life. But I'm looking at what's happening to the few remaining whites in Laikipia in Kenya. And I'm hearing now what you're saying about South African farmers in South Africa. I mean, what, they're just being murdered in their beds? What happens?
Yeah, I think that it comes down to this perception that farmers are wealthy. This land automatically means indication of wealth. There are a lot of poor farmers. Farming is very difficult. It's very difficult to be profitable. And
I imagine you need vast tracts of land
Precisely.
to make small amounts of money.
so what's happening now, the way that these farm attacks are being addressed is that farmers are moving off their farms and moving into the local towns
Yeah.
and simply going back and forth every day, and they're not actually inhabiting the homesteads on their farms because that's where they're being attacked.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So it's become that dangerous.
It's extremely dangerous, and it's very sad because, farmers are ultimately responsible for the food security of a country, and the ANC has been really poor at expressing that, and it's abolished.
We've certainly seen this in Zimbabwe, haven't we, where expropriated farms, which have been handed over to black Zimbabweans, have been completely inadequate to the task of producing food or rearing livestock because they haven't got the skills.
I lived in Johannesburg with a friend of mine who actually also now lives in London, and his family had a really productive farm in Zimbabwe, and they got violently evicted. But as these guys were leaving, they started burning the combine harvesters, which is a piece of kit that costs $1 million. And that is exactly why things have gone wrong, because to them, Massey Ferguson or John Deere would have represented some sort of a Western idea.
Sorry, when you say they started burning
the
the
war,
combine,
the invaders.
the invaders,
The invaders, not the family.
not the families sort of salting the earth.
Not
no,
the family.
no.
The invaders started burning. They torched their combine harvesters, and they cut stakes off the cattle while they were still standing. And this is a microcosm. This is an explanation as to the failure of the entire country in the invasion of one farm.
Whoa. Okay. So you've got. Could it get that bad in South Africa?
I don't think so. I don't believe so. And these guys are the farmers are the most resilient people. So I'll go on the story about Zimbabwe, and it would probably indicate what South African farmers would do if they ever found in this situation, is that when the farmers were evicted in 2000 and Robert Mugabe was faced with electoral defeat, these guys went to countries that they had no experience in, they had no land in, but made arrangements with the governments to lease or be given a piece of land to make productive. Fast forward 15 years.
Which countries, for example?
Ghana, Congo, Mozambique, Malawi, surrounding countries,
Right, okay.
not really South Africa or Namibia
Right.
or Botswana, but countries to the north. And as I said, you come 15 years later, and the white farmers that were kicked off their land during those bullshit farm invasions are now producing crops to send back to Zimbabwe.
Do you think that Zimbabwe can ever recover? I mean, Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of Southern Africa. Fantastic country, lovely. Got the Vic Falls, got all sorts of. Did have some game until it got eaten. But do you think that when Mugabe goes, no?
He has, what's happened behind him is a sense of greed and partially conspired by his wife, who is a piece of work, Grace, and partially conspired by other people jockeying for positions within the ZANU-PF. I don't pay any attention to this. I think Mugabe's 5 years younger than he actually is. So this thing about him being 93, I would say is 87, 88. This has been a credible suspicion. He's got more time left in him, and in all likelihood, it's going to be his wife or his daughter who. So you've got a proper tin pot being. You've got a kleptocracy that's intergenerational. Shortly.
Where in Africa do you have the most hope for?
I think I have the most hope for South Africa.
Do you? So maybe now, if you're an investor, would you be buying?
Absolutely, I'd be investing in ICT, information communication. I'd be investing in.
Why is that? Why is
because there's got a very poor broadband infrastructure, and the man who lays the most cables is going to be the man who who wins at the end. And I would be doing that. I'd be competing with the multinational mobile companies. There are all sorts of opportunities: tourism, hotels, aviation.
So you think, despite everything, despite the Guptas stuff,
it's all falling apart for them, and Jacob Zuma will go, not before throwing the Guptas under the bus and about 500 other people. They're all going to go to jail, by the way. All of the people who've been involved in the Guptas' schemes and ploys are going to jail. I had a guy when I was in Johannesburg, and I didn't really have, I wasn't part of a big corporation, but I had a guy who was an ANC activist who was on the lookout for me, and someone who remains a very good friend. He was very, very successful. And he got off the train at Paddington. I went to meet him the other day, and the first thing he said to me was, "Relax, they are all going to jail." And that means all the government officials that have conspired with the Guptas, all of the multinational firms like SAP, like McKinsey, like KPMG, that have all been revealed to have been in some deal with the Guptas, rent-seeking and gatekeeping. They're all going to go to jail.
Are they?
2
Really?
years of consistent procession of people going to Pollsmoor prison in Turkey.
So who has overseen this cleansing?
Civil society, non-government organizations, and eventually the ANC will be forced into itself. Upon Zuma's departure, you'll have a non-compromise band of people coming through.
But what about the who's the one settler, one bullet guy? The guy who keeps what's that
idiot?
That extreme party.
Yeah, but he's bought by the Guptas, so he's talking nonsense. He doesn't actually believe that. He's heavily in debt. He's got bank repossessions coming out of his ears. His name is Andile Ngetima or something like that. I've forgotten. But he's going around saying one settler, one bullet. He's got another one. He's probably also going to go to jail for some or other reason. They'll find out if he has taken money from the Guptas, because it'll probably result in taxpayers' money that's been taken.
I must say, I'm very happy to hear this. So you know how when you become a sort of grown-up person, you have a continent that you particularly fall in love with, and some people become Asia hands, and I suppose a very few become South America hands. Probably more in America than we do here because of the geography. But Africa's always been my. You know how it gets under your skin after a time.
Of course.
What is it?
People are a large part of it. I think it's the natural beauty, and it's the source of everything. I mean,
where we all began.
Where we all began.
It's certainly true that anyone who hasn't been to Africa, and I mean proper Africa, you can't really count sub-Saharan Africa.
Yes.
And
it's not Egypt or something like that.
No, and experience life in the bush. It's just amazing,
wonderful,
isn't it?
It's absolutely fantastic.
The scenery is just so stunning. The massiveness of the skies.
Yeah. And
the wildlife.
It is, and it's the smell of the sea in certain coastal villages that comes off the sea. It's the sunsets. It's the quality of infrastructure, like roads, which is surprising because you think that you're going to some backwater, but actually, it's surprisingly well maintained. The place is not it surprises you, and I think that's what it is, James. It keeps surprising you.
If you were going to go there as a tourist, what would be your pick? I'll tell you mine in a moment.
As countries.
Well, yeah, where in South Africa? Safari or whatever. What would you do? What's the best?
I'd probably go hot air balloon in Tanzania. That's an experience. That's a remarkable experience.
Is Tanzania okay now?
Yeah, it's a great place. It's fabulous.
It's well run. Because when I was there, it was run by
communists.
Nyerere. Yeah. Communists.
Yeah, idiot.
It was a basket case.
Yeah. I think that I share your sentiments of Kenya. I think that Mozambique is utterly sensational. Seychelles is amazing. It's very expensive, North Island, but it's beautiful.
Do you know, I've been to Seychelles so many times. I'm sick of it.
Really?
I've been there.
Really?
I've been there 3 times.
Have you been to North Island?
I've been to Fregat. I've been to some really good ones.
Yes.
I've been to, Fregat's actually in the Amarantis, I think.
Have you ever been to the Comores?
I haven't, no.
There was this wonderful story about. Did you ever hear of a mercenary called Bob Denard, who was a Frenchman?
Yes, of course I did. Yeah.
You know, he had a harem of young African ladies on that
Right.
island. He rode into the city, Moroni. It's a shithole, but it's got an interesting history. Oh.
What? So, are you recommending the Comoros?
No.
or not?
I was just
okay.
asking a question.
I do want to go to Mozambique, very, very much.
Yes.
But I think my recommendation would probably be, I think Namibia. It's got to be, hasn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Skeleton Coast.
Yes, it's
And I
breathtakingly beautiful.
I went to a game reserve in Namibia,
Yeah.
which is only accessible by light aircraft, which was on the Angolan border, and it was just so awesome.